Okay, thank you all for having me here to talk today about the Texas Cultivated Oyster Mariculture program. Obviously, this is a new program that's just getting started this year, so I'm going to give some background and kind of go over what the program is going to look like, and along with some of the conservation measures we're going to be using to make sure this program doesn't have any negative impact. And so a little brief bit of background first. So Texas is the last Gulf state to have oyster mariculture. We've been an entirely wild fishery up until this point, with the caveat that we have had the certificate of location program in Galveston Bay, and some might be tempted to call that mariculture, but it's not actually true mariculture. So way back in the day, we were issuing these leases for small parts of wild reefs where the leaseholders could apply for a permit to transfer oysters out of waters that were closed by the health department for health concerns and transfer those onto these leases, let them depuridate, and then sell them. So that wasn't true mariculture because you're still depending on wild product and wild reef to make that happen. But that is, the one extra bit of fishery that we've had in Galveston Bay. But we haven't issued a transfer permit in since I think about 2012, and we haven't issued any new leases since the early 90s or late 80s. With that included, we are still a pretty robust fishery, even without true mariculture. We're $20 million plus. Actually, last year it was much higher than that. Wild fishery. So it's a big economy in oyster fisheries. And last year we had 18 active seafood dealers and 486 active fishing vessels. And so we can see that here. So this is, again, just the wild fishery. And so the orange line indicates the vessel value, and that's the monetary value, the economic value of the fishery. And you can see, and this is the y-axis on the left, the dollar sign. And you can see in 2019, we were up to almost $35 million of value on the fishery. The blue line indicates the meat weight in pounds of product that's actually been harvested, and that corresponds to the y-axis on the right side of that figure. And you can see that there's been a slight decline in the meat weight of the product that's been harvested over time, and a slight increase in the value of the fishery. So what that means is that the price per pound of oysters has increased over time. And so it used to be, I think, about $2 a pound back in 2000, and now we're almost up to $6 a pound, I believe, this past year. And so that value of oysters has gone up, and harvest pressure has also increased. So you can see on the bottom right, that's active commercial oyster vessels over time. And you can see there's more and more actively fishing vessels. They're landing more and more, or sorry, less product, but its value is increasing. So we actually have a pretty highly valued fishery. Meanwhile, this is data from our monitoring program that shows the relative abundance of oysters in the bay. The larger graph up on the top has it broken apart by bay system. So that yellow line on top is Aransas Bay, and the blue line on the bottom is Galveston Bay. And so this is showing the relative abundance of oysters from our monitoring program on those reefs over time. On the bottom right, you can see that's the coastwide trend. So that's if we average all of those bay systems together. And so you can see when you look at this coastwide, there's a slight decrease in the trend of oyster abundance across the coast over time. And so that kind of coupled with that information before tells us that we're slightly decreasing in how many oysters are out there, but we're still maintaining pressure on them. And so I think the hope for a lot of people is that oyster mariculture is actually going to kind of help alleviate that a little bit. But nobody's really sure if it's actually going to be a significant player at this time, or if it's just going to be kind of a small addition to the fishery that we currently have. I've certainly heard experts talk about it in both directions, as if this is actually going to alleviate pressure from the wild fishery, or if this is just going to kind of add additional economy without relieving pressure. We can look to what's going on in other states. I just kind of did some research quickly and threw up some states up on this screen that you can see. So for example, Virginia is going to be the most comparable, and this is just from aquaculture, with almost $20 million generated a year, and that was from a 2012 report. Florida is making about $4 million a year, but they actually just started mariculture within the last 10 years, so it's still very new. So Florida and Alabama are both still very new mariculture activities. But in all cases, what you can see on the two figures on the bottom, from North Carolina and from Virginia, in all cases that the number of farms and applications and harvest has all increased over time. So in the beginning of these programs, there was initially very little interest, and then there was more and more farms and more product every year. And I think that's probably what we can expect in Texas. So a little bit more about the legislation that was passed. So it's House Bill 1300, passed last year, the 86th legislative session. That created the new Chapter 75, the Cultivated Oyster Mariculture Program. And that delegated the authority to the Texas Parks and Wildlife Commission to establish the program and govern oyster mariculture. And it mandated that the program be adopted by August 31st of this year, and we actually adopted it early, so it was in May 21st that the commission adopted it. With only 1 year, so in between the time where that law passed and we had to have the program adopted by the commission, we had 1 year to determine what this program was going to look like. And it's not a whole lot of time to put an entire program together. So we started by looking to see what the other states were doing. We looked at every single state that has oyster mariculture. We even looked in other countries, to what Canada was doing, Australia, New Zealand. And we tried to learn from their lessons learned, the mistakes they've made, what worked well for them. We've participated in multiple regional meetings, oyster aquaculture and mariculture conferences, going to the Gulf States Marine Fisheries Commission and the Gulf of Mexico Alliance, and kind of talking with some of the other experts there to see what they were doing and learning from their lessons learned. We also worked very closely with our constituents and stakeholders. So Representative Todd Hunter had an oyster aquaculture task force, and then we actually had an additional oyster mariculture ad hoc working group. So we were working with potential members of this fishery, as well as NGOs and conservation agencies such as the Nature Conservancy and CCA. We had them all at the table getting input on what this program should look like. And so I would say that it was pretty well vetted throughout the process. In addition to that, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, we had to coordinate with multiple state and federal agencies because they all have some sort of jurisdiction over mariculture type activities. And so we also had to talk to the GLO, the General Land Office, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the Texas Department of State Health Services, the Department of Ag, the Army Corps, Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, and kind of gather all of their concerns and keep that in mind while we were designing this program to make sure that we were designing a program that was going to fit well with what all of the other state and federal agencies wanted to do. And so it was a lot of work, a lot of coordination, and I'd now like to kind of talk about what we came up with. So this is what the program looks like now. A couple of key points of interest about it. One is that it's facilitated by Texas Parks and Wildlife as compared to maybe the Department of Agriculture, which is a little bit more common in other states. It is also only off-bottom mariculture. Other states have a mixture of off-bottom and on-bottom, and by off-bottom I mean floating racks, trays, cages, things that are in the surface, or sorry, in the water column and it elevated off the surface of the bottom. We're not talking about placing mulch down, making these kind of oyster beds and then harvesting them with a dredge. That is not included in this. Additionally, this program is for oyster harvest only. We've gotten a lot of questions if this means that they can harvest clams or other things that might recruit. So this covers oysters only, and these oysters must be sold to certified shellfish dealers. So we're not having any directly from the oyster farm to the restaurant. They have to go through shellfish dealers just like they do now. The program also set aside 20% of fees collected to be used for abandoned gear removal. That was a big part of lessons learned that we heard from other agencies who've done this before, saying that the debris is an issue, so we need to be very proactive about making sure we're cleaning it up. And so we had that provision. And this program provides for 3 types of operations: grow outs, which are farms, which is what most people think about when they think about mariculture; nurseries, which is kind of in between hatcheries and grow out facilities, and that's when you have product that's too small to go out in the grow out farms, and maybe it's in between seed and actual product. And then hatcheries are where we're actually getting the seed from a brood stock and putting it on shell and sending it out. So this is just a couple pictures of what off-bottom mariculture. I took all of these images from pangaeashellfish.com, and you can see these are racks various types of racks. And so these are affixed to the bottom through PVC or through rebar, and so they do not float in the water column. So that's one type of approach to mariculture. And another one are floating options. And so here we have floating bags and an adjustable longline system. And so in these, there's usually a piling or two pilings and a line that goes between them, and then the gear floats on it so that it can rise and fall with the tide. And in the bottom picture, you can see that's where the tide has gone completely out and the bags are just hanging there. Where we don't have that kind of tidal variation in Texas. And so actually, let me go back. So these really depend on that, that these racks get kind of exposed at those lower tides. It really depends on a high range of tidal variation. But here, you can get away with a little bit less tidal variation with these floating operations. And so I anticipate that this is really more of what we're going to see in Texas. Yeah, and so like I said, we also have hatcheries and nurseries. Right now, we don't have any oyster hatcheries in Texas, and so this program is going to provide the structure for people to pursue those. And it does require a little bit of additional permitting. And then one of the things to think about is that we would be bringing in, until Texas hatcheries are established, we will be bringing in product from an out-of-state hatchery, which has never happened before. And so we're going to have to be very careful about genetic stocks and avoiding diseases coming in from other states. And so we're looking at that pretty critically through the permitting process. Speaking of permitting, I'm going to kind of quickly talk about what the permit is going to look like. So, excuse me. The Parks and Wildlife Commercial Cultivated Oyster Mariculture Permit, or CALM, I might refer to that as CALM in the future. In order to get one, someone would have to submit an operations plan telling exactly what they plan to do, what kind of cages they're going to use, how large the operation is going to be, how they're going to work it, how they're going to access the site, kind of all of that. And a natural resources survey, and I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. And so that natural resources survey would show that there's going to be no negative impact to any critical natural resources or habitats. There'll be a public comment period where the public will be allowed to come in and comment on the farm that's being proposed, and then they have to pay fees. So there's a $200 application fee, and then once it's approved, there's a $450 an acre for grow-out facilities, and a public water surcharge. That's just to Parks and Wildlife. That does not include the permits from other agencies. And so all of those agencies I listed before, the General Land Office, the Department of Ag, the Army Corps, they all have separate permitting processes. So once you go through and you get that COM permit, you have to get the rest, the GLO surface lease and the Army Corps nationwide permit and all of those together as well. And then whatever fees they may have. So the conditions of the permit from Parks and Wildlife is that these farms will have 10-year lease terms that are non-transferable and no subleasing. But there is no limitation on the number of acres or a number of permits that an individual can have. And that's fairly unique. Most other states, there is some sort of maximum number of acres or maximum number of permits to kind of discourage people from gobbling up land that they can't use. And one example of that is something called spite leases in other states. Some of the feedback we got from Virginia and North Carolina is that people with waterfront homes will often lease the bay bottom so that a farm cannot do it. So they've already, kind of claimed that area, so they don't have to look at a farm from their home. And so to discourage things like spite leasing, one, we have that $450 an acre fee that's just to us, and then whatever the GLO is going to charge as well. We also have this active use criteria saying that you have to stock 100,000 seed per acre per year. And so the idea is that between the fees and the active use criteria, that's going to be enough to deter people from just gobbling up a ton of area. So what are these operations going to look like? What are we going to allow? The first is that seed must come from Texas broodstock. And so that's what I was talking about earlier. This is the first time we're going to allow oyster product to be introduced from a hatchery out of state. And so we're going to have to be very careful about that because we're unique in Texas and that we have the genetic line between two distinct populations. And so basically everything from the upper coast of Texas all the way through Florida is very genetically similar. You can take an oyster from Alabama and put it in Mississippi and you wouldn't be able to tell the difference genetically. However, we have this area, as you can see in the figure on the right, where the two boxes overlap. there's that southern region kind of in Copano and Aransas Bay where the genetics actually shift to be a distinct population. And so we actually have to be extra careful here that we're getting brood stock from the right bay or the right region going off to the hatchery in another state, and that seed's coming back and going back in the right bay from wherever the brood stock came from. So we're going to enforce a pretty heavy paper trail to make sure that happens, along with lots of disease certifications and tests as well. We are not restricting types of off-bottom gear. You can have racks, cages, whatever you want. Operations will be during daylight hours only, and harvest will be year-round, not just during your normal months with an R. However, we will be enforcing the Texas Department of State Health Services time temperature matrix, and so basically they have a matrix that says how long you have until you have to get product into refrigeration, depending on what the air temperature is. So in the middle of summer, when we're seeing 100-degree temperatures, oftentimes that means the product has to get from the farm to refrigeration within an hour. So that's how we're allowing for year-round harvest, as long as that matrix is honored. We have a 2.5-inch minimum harvest size, and that's compared to the 3-inch minimum harvest size that we have with the wild populations. That was a long discussion, whether we wanted it to be 2.5 or 3 inches. The reason that you want 2.5, a smaller size, is you can turn over your product more quickly from the time you go from a seed to a mature oyster that you're able to sell. That's a lot shorter at 2.5 inches. And it seems as though these mariculture operations kind of cater to the boutique oyster, the half shell market. And so that, I guess, the smaller size is a little bit more desirable in that state, kind of like a deep cut small oyster. But the con to that is that we've made a lot of conservation progress in the past several years, trying to avoid poaching on oyster reefs. And so we really don't want people to be claiming that 2.5-inch oyster is from a mariculture operation when it's really from a wild reef. So to discourage that, boats that are operating under a mariculture permit will not be allowed to have a dredge on them, and that dredge would be indicative of them doing a harvesting from a wild reef. So additional operations, unused gear cannot be stored at the site, so we don't want people just leasing these areas and using them for storage, because that's how you get a marine debris problem. And sites must be marked according to Coast Guard standards, so we definitely want these sites to be visible. So I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk about the natural resource concerns. So those were the operations and kind of what the farms are going to look like. And now I'm going to talk about the back end. When we're reviewing a permit that we're going to get, what are we looking for to make sure that sensitive habitats like seagrass and sensitive species like wading or colonial birds are not going to be impacted? A quick background into how this may look in other states, and this was actually part of the things that we considered when we set up the program, is there's two main approaches to how most states configure mariculture. One is with a development area, and one is with a nominated site approach. So a development area is where the state owns a large tract and then subleases kind of subtracts out to people for their farms, and they're kind of aggregated together. And then the rents and the availability of these are established through bids. So for example, in this figure, we would say, okay, the state owns all of these squares, and we're going to say A1 is up for bid this year. And then people would bid on it, and then they would, put a farm in there. And that's desired by a lot of states because the state has the control over where the farm goes and natural resources concerns and things like that. But the state actually absorbs a lot of the cost of setting those up, surveying, permitting those areas, and then cost is regenerated as those bid fees are paid. Versus a nominated site where the state does not own or lease any aggregate area. It's just up to an individual to come to us and say, I want to put a farm here. So everybody's kind of taking care of and selecting the sites of their own farm locations, and the state's not really involved in it. So there's no bidding or anything like that. There's just kind of a flat rate in that. And so obviously this is what we went with because it is preferred by the industry for product branding. And so there was a lot of public support for the nominated site rather than the development area. So we will not, at this time, we will not have the development areas in Texas. So then we had to start thinking critically about site selection. So now that we're not doing those development areas, now that we're not the ones selecting the sites where these are going to go, we had to come up with a standardized way that we were going to review sites that were submitted to us to make sure there was going to be no natural resources concerns. And so some of the things we wanted to think about were, first, avoiding impacts to natural resources and sensitive habitats. Second, minimizing user conflicts, and by user conflicts I mean if it's a fishing hotspot or maybe a navigation area, obviously you don't want to put a farm there. And third, you also want the farms to go in environmental conditions that are conducive and suitable to the survival and the growth of oysters. To note, that last one, that's really up to the applicant. I mean, since they're nominated sites, it's going to be up to them to select a site that has the conditions that they want, and then it's up to us as the state permitting agency to review kind of the first two things and make sure that there's going to have no impacts at these sites that they're selected. So some of the requirements that state and federal agencies have come together and talked about for this, for Parks and Wildlife, we're requiring all farms to be 200 feet from seagrass, 500 feet from oysters, 2,000 feet from rookeries, and they must be in conditionally approved or approved areas only, and that's for grow out facilities. Farms have to be in areas that are approved by the health department. That's for fecal coliform concerns. For the general land office, they're going to require written permission of the landowner with anything within 1,000 feet of the shore, and that's so that that's kind of protecting landowners' rights to make sure they have access to their property. And then there's a 1,000-foot buffer from oil and gas infrastructure so that oil and gas infrastructure can be maintained or accessed if needed. The Fish and Wildlife Service has commented that they don't want any activities in less than 2 feet of water in whooping crane areas, because we're very lucky that we do have some whooping crane, overwintering whooping crane populations here. And so we're going to be very sensitive about that, making sure that these farms will not interact with whooping cranes. And the Fish and Wildlife Service also has some BMPs for things like mesh size to avoid entrapment of birds and sea turtles. And then in general, there's other user conflicts we want to kind of look out for that are usually going to come up in the core permitting process. But that's, are there navigation channels? Are there ports? Who owns the bay bottom? Is that a place where sand is dredged, or is it a spoil area? Those are the types of things you want to avoid. So to do that, we created a spatial planning tool where we basically listed out all of the concerns of all the agencies and then hunted down data for well over a year. We compiled all of the data we could possibly get our hands on from multiple agencies and entities. And it looks something like this. I can tell you that maybe 1/10 of the layers are turned on right now, even that, but you can see here, so this is a very colorful map of Coconut Bay, where the pinkish reddish colors are oyster reefs, and it has every single mapping effort ever, so that's why there's different colors of pink and red. There's different efforts, different mapping efforts for oysters there. You can see there's seagrass in there, which is the green. There's those teal rookery areas. There's those blue mitigation restoration sites. The magenta color is threatened and endangered species identified critical habitat. The hashed areas are prohibited and restricted areas for harvest. And so you can kind of start to visualize all of the conflicts that might exist at a site through this. And here's an example site. Somebody was interested in putting a site here, but you can see once you start turning those layers on, there's pipelines, there's wells, there's seagrass, there's oysters, there's threatened and endangered species habitat in that salt marsh right there. And so you can start to visualize all of these things at each site that's proposed. Screenshot of the table of contents of my ArcGIS document because I thought it was funny. I couldn't even fit it all on one page, but as you can see on the right, it's kind of a blow up, and you can see the different habitat layers. And you can see we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different oyster habitat maps are in this, and multiple seagrass habitats. So it's every habitat map that we could find, as well as any user conflict information that we can find. So on the left is kind of a zoomed out version of all of the layers on my GIS document collapsed and closed. You can see just how many things are in this tool. It's pretty huge. And then after we look at that tool, we also require a natural resources survey. And so the spatial planning tool identifies historic conditions at the site, if anything has been mapped there in the past, but the survey identifies present conditions at the site. And you really need both types of information to review the sites. Because these leases are for 10 years long, we don't want to make our decision based only on the current snapshot, because of things like seagrass are so variable. They'll be here one year and gone the next, depending on salinity and things like that. And so we want to look, has it been here in the last 10, 20 years? And we answer that with the tool. And then is it there now? And that's what we answer with the Natural Resources Survey. So we do have, this is a picture, a schematic of what the survey might look like. So that's their 1 acre site in the top left-hand corner. And so obviously in the footprint of the site itself, there's going to be a lot more samples. So each one of those blue dots is a sediment grab to make sure there's no seagrass or oysters there. And then outside in that 200 and 500 foot buffer that I was talking about earlier, 200 feet from seagrass and 500 feet from oysters, we also want to make sure that buffer is sampled to make sure there's no natural resources within that 200 or 500 feet. And so that's kind of what the Natural Resource Survey looks like in terms of if people choose to do grab samples rather than something like side scan sonar. So that's it in a nutshell, kind of an overview of what the program looks like, how it's regulated with the permitting processes, and how we're trying to avoid any negative impact to natural resources. If you want more information, our website is finally live. That's a picture of it right there. You can email me and I'll send you the link if you'd like to. It has points of contact that you can call with questions for different parts of the coast. It has best management practices, frequently asked questions, and it also has a little viewer. This is a dummy viewer right now. That blue dot isn't real, but eventually, as people are permitting sites, once they're permitted or pending a permit, they'll show up on this map, and you'll be able to see who has farms where across the coast. With that, I'll take any questions.